12 horses, dead or dying, and a wedding scheduled for that same afternoon. Caleb Ashford stood in his stable at dawn, watching everything he had built over 19 years collapse in front of him, one animal at a time. No doctor had answers. No neighbor had solutions. The ranch that bore his father's name was rotting from the inside out, and he couldn't stop it. Then a train pulled into the station, and a woman stepped off carrying nothing but a single bag and a water-stained notebook that belonged to her dead grandmother. Nobody believed she could save those horses. She didn't care. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will shake you. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You won't want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. A man can lose his land and recover, lose his animals and rebuild, but lose his will, and there is nothing left to save. Oh, the first horse went down on a Tuesday. Caleb didn't think much of it at first. Caesar, the old bay gelding, had always been dramatic about heat. The animal had collapsed twice before during bad summers, and both times he'd been upright and eating oats within the hour. So when Caleb found him lying on his side in the east stall, chest heaving, eyes half closed and glazed with something that looked almost like confusion, Caleb crouched down, pressed a hand to the horse's neck, and told him the same thing he'd said during those other episodes. "Get up, old man. You've done this before." Caesar did not get up. By Thursday, 3 more horses had fallen. By Sunday, the number was 7. Caleb stopped sleeping sometime around Friday. He wasn't sure exactly when, only that at some point the boundary between night and morning stopped mattering, and he simply existed inside the stable, moving from stall to stall with a lantern and a bucket of water that never seemed to help anything. Doc Harlan had come out twice. The second visit, he'd arrived with a younger colleague from 2 towns over, a man named Peterson who wore clean boots and used medical terminology that sounded impressive and ultimately meant nothing. Fever of unknown origin, Peterson had said, scribbling in a leather notebook. Could be equine encephalitis, could be a respiratory variant, could be something else entirely. Could be? Caleb repeated flatly. I'd recommend isolation of the remaining animals and supportive hydration. Beyond that, Peterson clicked his pen closed. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford. I really am. Caleb had walked both men back to their wagon without another word. He stood in the dirt and watched the wheels kick up dust down his long entrance road, and he felt something inside his chest go very quiet. Not broken exactly, just quiet. The way a fire goes quiet when the last log finally surrenders. He was 41 years old. He had inherited this land from his father at 22, already in debt and already behind. He had fought drought, fought low cattle prices, fought a bank that tried to call his loan 3 years running. He had bred these horses himself, starting with 2 mares and a stallion he'd purchased with money borrowed from a man who hadn't expected to be repaid. He had learned their personalities, their fears, their preferences. He knew which ones spooked at shadows and which ones would walk calmly through fire. And now he was watching them die in the dark, and no one could tell him why. The telegram about the bride had come 6 weeks earlier. It wasn't something Caleb had pursued aggressively, more something he had reluctantly agreed to after his neighbor, a red-faced man named Garrett Foss, who had too many opinions and never enough work to occupy them, had spent an entire autumn convincing him that a man needed a partner to properly run a working ranch. It's not about romance, Caleb, Garrett had said, leaning on a fence post like he owned it. It's about function. You need someone managing the household side of things, cooking, organizing, keeping records. You're running yourself into the ground trying to do everything alone. I manage fine. You ate standing up at the supply counter in town 3 times last week. Martha counted. Caleb had no response to that. So he had written to an agency in Dallas, filled out their paperwork with the minimum possible information, waited. Received a letter from a woman named Eliza Rowan, who was 28, had grown up in Tennessee, and described herself in clean, practical sentences that contained very little sentimentality. She knew how to keep accounts. She could manage a kitchen and a garden. She had no illusions about what frontier life required, having watched her own father work himself to nothing on a small farm outside Nashville. Caleb had written back. 2 letters total, both fairly brief. She had arrived at similar brevity. They had agreed, with the efficiency of 2 people completing a transaction, that she would arrive on the 18th of July and they would marry at the county office the following morning. The 18th of July was a Wednesday. The horses had started dying the previous Tuesday. He almost sent a telegram to stop her. He stood at the counter of the post office on Monday morning with the words already composed in his head. Circumstances have changed. Return ticket will be arranged. Apologize for inconvenience. And for a long moment he looked at the clerk, a young woman named Agnes who had the good sense not to ask what he needed. Then he walked out without sending anything. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because stopping her felt like admitting that things were beyond recovery, and he wasn't ready to say that out loud. Maybe because he was tired of making decisions, and this was one he could simply let happen. Maybe because some stubborn, irrational piece of him still believed that by Wednesday morning he would find a solution, the horses would stabilize, and things would return to something manageable. That stubborn piece of him was wrong. By the time Wednesday arrived, 8 horses had fallen, 1 had died. A young chestnut mare named Penny that Caleb had delivered himself 3 years ago, kneeling in the straw at 2 in the morning while her mother labored and the stable smelled like effort and blood and the specific exhaustion of new life. He had buried Penny in the northeast corner of the property, near the old oak tree, because she had liked standing in its shade. He barely had time to change his shirt before driving into town to meet the train. Eliza Rowan stepped onto the platform carrying 1 canvas bag, a leather satchel, and an expression that was impossible to read. She was not what he had pictured, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had pictured. She was taller than he expected, with dark hair pinned up unevenly, one side slightly higher than the other, like she'd done it in bad light, and brown eyes that moved quickly and quietly across everything in her field of vision, cataloging. She wore a practical gray dress with a small tear near the left cuff that had been repaired with thread that didn't quite match. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person they've heard described but haven't yet decided whether the description was accurate. Mr. Ashford. Miss Rowan. He took her bag without asking. Train was on time. It was. She fell into step beside him. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't slept. She didn't press. He appreciated that. The ride back to the ranch took 40 minutes along a road that was mostly dust and stubbornness. Caleb didn't talk much under ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances, so he said almost nothing. He told her the spare room was prepared. He told her the well was on the west side of the house. He mentioned that supper would be simple because he hadn't had time to do proper shopping. Eliza looked out at the land passing beside them and asked, after a long silence, "What's wrong with the horses?" He glanced at her. "How did you know something was wrong with the horses?" "Your hands." She nodded toward them on the reins. "You're holding the leather too tight, and you keep looking toward the stable every time we pass a gap in the fence line. Whatever's in that building is what you're thinking about, not the road, not me." She paused. "I don't mean that as a criticism." Caleb exhaled slowly. "There's a sickness moving through the herd. Started last Tuesday. 2 doctors came out. Neither of them could identify it. How many animals? Lost 1. 8 more are down. Eliza was quiet for a moment. How many total in the herd? 14, or 13 now. She nodded and said nothing else for the rest of the drive. But when they turned up the entrance road and the stable came into view, old wood, sagging on the left corner, the door standing open because he'd been in and out so many times it was no longer worth closing, she watched it with an attention that was different from sympathy. It was the attention of someone trying to understand a problem, not grieve it. Yeah. Dinner was cornbread, salt pork, and cold beans that had been sitting since the previous night. Caleb set it on the table and sat down across from her with the expression of a man who had ceased to care about hospitality. I know this isn't— It's fine, Eliza said, and helped herself without ceremony. They ate. The silence wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it wasn't painful either. It was the silence of 2 strangers who understood they didn't yet have the vocabulary to speak naturally to each other and were willing to wait until they did. After a while, Eliza said, "Tell me about the horses. Before they got sick, what were they like?" Caleb looked up. It was not the question he expected. What do you mean, what were they like? Temperament? Habits. What they ate, what they avoided, how they behaved in heat versus cold. I want to understand what's normal for them so I can understand what isn't. He set his fork down. Why? Because I may be able to help. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but with the honest skepticism of someone who had already watched 2 professionals fail. 2 doctors with actual medical training came out here and couldn't identify the sickness. You've been on my property for 3 hours. I know. She didn't flinch at this. Tell me about them anyway. Something about the steadiness of her voice, not arrogant, not desperate, just settled, made him answer. Maybe because he hadn't talked about the horses to anyone except the veterinarians, who only wanted clinical information, and there was something about the question, what were they like, that cracked something open in him unexpectedly. So he talked. He told her about Caesar, the old bay, 23 years old and stubborn as hardpan. He told her about the 2 young stallions, Flint and River, that he'd bred from a Tennessee walking horse and a quarter-horse bloodline he was particularly proud of. He told her about the mares, their temperaments, their grazing preferences. He told her which ones came to the fence when he called and which ones pretended not to hear. Eliza listened without interrupting. She asked quiet questions when he paused. What do they drink from? Is the water source shared? Do any of them graze closer to the creek? And Caleb answered them, only gradually realizing that these were not casual questions. She was building something in her head. He could see it in the focused stillness of her expression. After dinner, while Caleb went back to the stable for his evening check, Eliza sat at the kitchen table and opened the leather satchel. Inside was a journal. Old. The cover warped and stained, the pages thick and uneven. The handwriting inside was small and slanted, in a hand that was not Eliza's. She turned to a specific section near the back half of the book, smoothed the page flat with her palm, and began to read in the faint circle of lantern light. Caleb came back inside around midnight. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen when he saw her still at the table, the journal open in front of her, 3 pieces of paper covered in her own handwriting arranged beside it. You should sleep, he said. So should you. She didn't look up. Who had this land before your father? He blinked. The aldermans. Why? And before them? I don't know. Some cattleman out of San Antonio, I think, before my time. Is there a creek on the eastern edge of the property? Yeah, runs about a quarter mile east of the stable. Trees up in August usually, but it's still running now. Eliza made a note. And the horses that are sickest, are any of them the ones that graze closest to that creek? Caleb went very still. He ran back through the days in his head. Caesar's stall was next to the east pasture gate. The two young stallions preferred the east pasture in the mornings because the shade came sooner. Penny, the one he'd lost, had been the most enthusiastic creek grazer of all of them. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, most of them. Eliza looked up for the first time. My grandmother kept this journal for 40 years. She was an herbalist and a healer in Tennessee, mostly for animals because people didn't trust women with human patients. There was a dry quality to the way she said this, not quite bitterness. She documented an illness in the 1840s that moved through livestock in a farming community outside Knoxville. The symptoms match what you're describing almost exactly. Fever, muscle weakness. The animals go down, but they don't always go fast. It takes them slowly. Caleb came the rest of the way into the kitchen. He stood on the other side of the table and looked at the journal without touching it. What caused it? Stagnant water combined with a particular type of root vegetation that grows near slow-moving creeks. The plant isn't toxic enough to kill outright. It accumulates. Animals that graze near it over weeks build up enough of a compound in their system that it begins to interfere with their temperature regulation. She paused. My grandmother treated it. With what? Willow bark, peppermint, chamomile, and a few other things. The treatment works by helping the body process and clear the compound. It's not fast, but she documented 11 animals treated, 10 recovered. Caleb stared at her. The lantern light between them was low and warm, and the rest of the house was completely silent. Miss Rowan, he said carefully, I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do. But a doctor, 2 doctors, came out here with actual training and modern equipment, and they were looking for a pathogen, Eliza said quietly. A bacteria or a virus, something modern medicine knows how to classify. This isn't that. This is a toxin accumulation from a specific plant that doesn't show up in any standard examination because no one's looking for it. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to let me try. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. He was a man who had been let down by official answers. He was a man who had buried a horse that morning and watched 8 more struggle through the night. He was a man who was, if he was being honest with himself, out of options. If you damage any of them, he started, I won't. You can't know that. No, she said. I can't. She didn't dress it up. But I know this treatment, and I know those symptoms, and I believe I can help them. She closed the journal carefully. Let me try. The clock on the wall ticked 4 times in the silence between them. All right, Caleb said. His voice was rough with exhaustion and something that wasn't quite hope yet. Trust us, but he didn't know she slipped out before dawn. He woke at first light to an empty kitchen and a note on the table written in that same clean, practical handwriting from her letters. Gone to gather what I need, back before noon. Don't move the horses. He stood in the kitchen holding the note for a moment, not sure whether he felt foolish or grateful or something he didn't have a word for yet. Then he went back to the stable because that was where he needed to be, and he sat down on an overturned bucket next to Caesar's stall, and he watched the old horse breathe. In, out, still fighting, still here. Stubborn, Caleb said quietly. The horse's ear moved slightly toward his voice. Caleb pressed his palm flat against the stall door and stayed there, in the pale gray morning light, waiting for a woman he barely knew to come back from the hills with plants from a dead woman's journal and the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the eastern creek, he could hear footsteps moving through long grass. She was already working. She came back at 10:30, not noon. Caleb heard her before he saw her. The soft crunch of boots on dry earth, the rustling of something heavy being set down near the back porch. He walked out from the stable and found her kneeling beside a canvas sack the size of a feed bag, sorting through what she'd collected with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before and had no time to explain herself while doing it. Her dress was damp from the knee down. There was a long scratch along her left forearm, already dried to a thin, dark line, and a smear of reddish mud across her right cheek that she either hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered with. Her hair, which had been pinned up when she left, had mostly given up and was hanging loose around her shoulders in the heat. She looked up when his shadow fell across her. "I need a large pot, the biggest you have, and a fire. Not the stove. I need open flame if you have it. Is there a fire ring anywhere on the property?" "Behind the bunkhouse. Haven't used it in a while." "That's fine." She stood lifting the sack. "I also need clean water, not creek water. Well, water only." "I know where my own well is," he said, a little more sharply than he intended. She glanced at him. "I know you do." He took the sack from her without asking. It was heavier than it looked, packed with bundles of plants, some wrapped in damp cloth to keep them from wilting, others loose and fragrant. He could smell the peppermint immediately, clean and sharp in the heavy summer air. They set up near the fire ring behind the bunkhouse. Caleb dug out his largest iron pot from the back of the kitchen, a thing his mother had used for washing, wide-mouthed and deep, and carried it out without comment. He built the fire himself, something he was good at, and had it going properly within 10 minutes while Eliza organized her materials on an old wooden table she'd dragged out from the bunkhouse doorway. She worked with the journal open beside her, referencing it frequently, cross-checking proportions and timing. Her hands moved quickly but not carelessly. She stripped willow bark into thin pieces, measured chamomile by the loose handful, bruised fresh peppermint leaves between her palms, before dropping them into the heating water. She added 2 other plants he didn't recognize, one with a bitter smell that made him take a half step back without meaning to, and one with pale silver-green leaves she treated with more care than everything else, measuring it by a specific count of leaves rather than by volume. "What's that one?" he asked, nodding toward the silver-green plant. "My grandmother called it creek sage. It's not the common variety." She counted leaves with her lips moving slightly. "It's the important one. Too little does nothing. Too much can cause problems of its own." She paused, recounted, then nodded to herself and dropped exactly the right number into the pot. "Your fire is good. Thank you." "I can build a fire," he said again. "I know." There was something almost amused in the way she said it. Almost. He leaned against the fence post and watched her work. He didn't have a better option. The horses were as settled as they were going to get for the moment. The morning chores were done, and there was something about watching her that he couldn't quite make himself walk away from. Not because of anything romantic or sentimental, more because she moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and he had spent the last week surrounded by people who very clearly did not. And the contrast was something he needed to look at for a while. "How long before it's ready?" he asked. "The first batch needs to steep for 2 hours after it boils. Then cool. Then we can start." She adjusted the position of the pot over the flame. "We won't see results immediately. I want to be clear about that. The treatment has to accumulate in their systems the same way the toxin did. We're looking at days, not hours." "How many days?" She met his eyes. "I don't know exactly. My grandmother's notes suggest the worst cases took close to 2 weeks to turn." Caleb absorbed this without expression, the way a man absorbs information he doesn't like but understands he has to accept. "All right," he said. She turned back to the pot. "Your arm," he said. She glanced at the scratch, which had reopened slightly and was threading a thin line of blood toward her wrist. "It's fine. Thorn bush near the creek. There's iodine in the house." "After," she said. "The medicine is more important." He almost said something to that. Instead, he went inside, found the iodine and a clean strip of cloth, and left them on the table beside her without comment. She looked at them, then at him, and said nothing. But she used them. The first animal she treated was Caesar. Caleb had expected her to start with one of the younger horses. Something less precious, he supposed, if the treatment went wrong. But Eliza walked straight into the stable, assessed each horse with quiet and methodical attention, and chose Caesar specifically. "He's the oldest," Caleb said. It came out as a protest. "He's also been in contact with the water source longer than the others, which means the accumulation is highest in his system." She was already moving toward the stall. "If the treatment works on him, it'll work on the others." "And if it doesn't work on him?" She opened the stall door. "Then we'll learn something from that too." It was not the reassurance he wanted. He knew that. But he also knew it was honest. And at this point in his life, he thought he preferred honesty over reassurance, even when honesty felt worse going down. She had transferred the medicine to a smaller clay pot that she could handle easily, fitted with a cloth spout she'd fashioned from something in her satchel. The liquid was dark amber, smelling of peppermint and something earthier underneath. She approached Caesar slowly, speaking to him in a low, even voice. Not the kind of bright, performed calm that strangers sometimes use with animals, which horses see through immediately, but something quieter and more genuine, like she was simply talking to him. "I know you feel terrible," she said. "I'm not going to pretend this tastes good. It won't." Caesar's ear tilted toward her. His eyes were still glazed, his breathing labored, but his head was up, barely. She got about half the first dose into him without much trouble. Then Caesar decided he was done cooperating and turned his head away with the particular stubbornness of a very old horse who had earned the right to his opinions. "Come on," Eliza said, not pleading, more like a quiet negotiation. "A little more." Caesar did not care about her negotiation. Caleb watched from outside the stall, arms folded on the top rail. "He does that. He's been doing it his whole life." "I can see that." Eliza repositioned herself, moving to the other side of Caesar's head. The horse tracked her with one eye. "Does he respond better to anything? Specific sounds or—" "He likes singing," Caleb said. Eliza turned and looked at him. "You're serious?" "My mother used to sing to him when he was young. He never forgot it. Whenever he gets stubborn about something, a few bars of whatever usually settles him down." He paused. "I haven't actually tried it myself. I don't sing." Eliza looked at the horse, looked back at Caleb. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite classify. Not amusement, exactly, more like a decision being made quickly. She started singing. It was an old song, a Tennessee folk melody he didn't recognize, sung quietly and without any particular performance to it. Her voice was medium in quality, not beautiful exactly, but genuine, and she held the tune without wavering. Caesar's ear turned toward her, his head lowered slightly. She guided the clay pot to his mouth and continued singing, and the old horse, apparently deciding that this strange woman had earned some cooperation, accepted the rest of the dose without further argument. Caleb unclenched his jaw, which he hadn't realized he'd been clenching. They treated 4 horses that first day. By the second dose that evening, Eliza had developed a routine, moving from stall to stall with the quiet efficiency of someone who had found her rhythm. Caleb helped. He was useful for lifting, for holding, for the physical management of animals that still had enough strength to resist. He found himself taking direction from her without the resistance he'd expected to feel, because she gave direction cleanly and without condescension, the way someone gives direction when they respect the person they're directing. That evening, after the last treatment, they sat on the back porch because neither of them had the energy to go inside. The heat had dropped to something almost bearable. The fire ring was cold. The sky was the deep, saturated blue of a Texas summer evening, fading at the horizon toward orange. Eliza had her grandmother's journal open on her knee, but wasn't reading it, just holding it. "Do you actually think this is going to work?" Caleb asked. She didn't answer immediately. He appreciated that she didn't. "I think it has the best chance of anything available to us," she said finally. "That's not the same as being certain." "No, it's not." He looked out toward the stable. "Penny, the one I lost. She was the best horse I've ever bred. I raised her myself. Her mother had a difficult labor, and I was there the whole night." He stopped. "That probably sounds ridiculous to someone who didn't know her." "It doesn't." Her voice was straightforward, not particularly soft, but not dismissive either. "She mattered to you. That's not ridiculous." "She was 3 years old." Eliza was quiet. Then she said, "My father lost every pig he owned to fever the winter I was 12. He didn't speak for 2 days. My mother thought he was sick. He wasn't sick, he just—" She paused, looking for the right word. "He needed the silence." "Did he recover? The farm?" "Partially." A small pause. "He never quite got back to what it was before, but he didn't stop either." She closed the journal. "He was a stubborn man." "That a compliment where you come from?" "In farming it is." A mockingbird called from somewhere in the oak trees, 3 notes repeated and then varied. The stable was quiet, which meant at least that nothing was in crisis. Caleb had learned to read the stable's silences over 19 years. The silence right now was not peaceful exactly, but it was stable, waiting, the same quality as a held breath. He realized he was doing the same thing. Garrett Foss came by Thursday morning. Caleb heard the wagon before he saw it and felt the specific flattening sensation that Garrett's visits tended to produce. He was in the stable mixing the morning's batch of medicine under Eliza's direction. She had started teaching him the proportions so the work could proceed faster. When Garrett's wagon rattled to a stop near the front gate and the man himself climbed down with the energy of someone who had news he was eager to deliver. "Caleb." Garrett looked at the stable, then at the smoke still rising from the previous night's fire ring. Then at Caleb's hands, which were stained slightly from the willow bark. "What in the Lord's name is going on here?" "Morning, Garrett. I heard your horses are down. Lost one already, someone told me." He walked up without being invited, as he always did. "Doc Harlan said there was nothing to be done. Said you might be looking at losing the whole herd. Doc Harlan was here 4 days ago." "And?" Garrett looked around. "What's changed?" Eliza came out of the stable carrying a cloth and the clay pot. She had met Garrett once, briefly, at the train station on the day she arrived. He had been there picking up a delivery, and the introduction had been approximately 30 seconds long and entirely forgettable. Garrett looked at her, at the pot, at the herbs drying on the fence rail that Caleb had strung up for that purpose. His expression went through several stages in a very short time. What is that?" "Good morning," Eliza said. "She's treating the horses," Caleb said. With what? That's kitchen medicine. Garrett's voice had taken on the particular tone of a man who had decided he was concerned but was actually mostly offended. Caleb, you've got animals dying in there. You can't be wasting time with 3 horses stood up yesterday, Caleb said. Garrett stopped. 3, Caleb repeated. Caesar's still down, but his fever broke last night. Flint walked to his water bucket on his own this morning for the first time in 6 days. He held Garrett's gaze. Doc Harlan said there was nothing to be done. I'm looking at 3 horses on their feet instead of lying in the dirt. Garrett's mouth worked for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza with an expression that was complicated. Not respect exactly, but the uncomfortable rearrangement that happens when evidence contradicts a conclusion that felt certain. Well, he said, you should still get another doctor out here, a proper... Garrett, Caleb said quietly. Thank you for coming by. It was a dismissal, delivered without hostility, which made it harder to argue with. Garrett stood there another moment, looked at the fence rail with the drying herbs, looked at Eliza once more, and then climbed back into his wagon. He left the way he'd arrived, the wheels kicking up dust, and this time Caleb didn't watch them go. He turned back to the stable. Let's get the next batch ready. 3 horses stood up, Eliza said. She wasn't quite smiling, but her voice had a quality that wasn't her usual flatness. You told him 3. I did. You didn't mention you were awake until 2 in the morning checking on them. That wasn't relevant information? She made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly contained. She went back into the stable. But the recovery was not a straight line. That was the thing about it that Caleb found the hardest, the way it refused to be simple. Thursday evening, River, one of the young stallions, took a turn that made Caleb's chest go tight. He had been one of the first to show small signs of improvement, eating a little, lifting his head with something approaching interest when Caleb came in. Then at evening, feeding, he was down again, shaking. Temperature spiked so high that the skin of his neck was hot to the touch. Caleb stood outside the stall and felt something crack inside him. Not completely, not like it had cracked when Penny died. More like an old wound that had been closing slowly and had just been pulled open again. Is he started. Eliza was already inside the stall, both hands on the horse, her expression doing that focused, closed-off thing it did when she was working. His body is fighting the toxin. This can happen. Her voice was steady. It's not the same as getting worse. It feels the same. It isn't. How do you know? Because my grandmother documented this. The 3rd or 4th day of treatment, some animals spike again before they turn. She called it the last argument. She was already measuring out an additional smaller dose, something she hadn't given before. This is where the treatment has to hold. And if it doesn't hold? She looked up at him. Then it doesn't. He wanted to throw something. He didn't. He sat down on the hay bale outside River's stall and stayed there while she administered the treatment and talked to the horse in the same low, matter-of-fact voice she used for everything. And the night pressed in around the stable and the lanterns made the old wood glow amber and Caleb Ashford, who had not cried when he buried Penny because there had been no time, and he'd been too numb anyway, sat very still and held himself together by main force. An hour later, River's shaking slowed. Another hour, and it stopped. Eliza came out of the stall and sat down on the hay bale beside him. Not close, just nearby. She didn't say anything. She pulled her grandmother's journal onto her knee and started reading by lantern light, and Caleb sat there and breathed the air that smelled like horses and medicine and old wood. And outside, the Texas night was enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that only empty, wild places can be. Your grandmother, he said finally, She taught you all this? I used to follow her on her rounds when I was small. She'd spend half the day on other people's farms, treating animals, leaving remedies. She never charged what she could have charged. Eliza turned a page. She said knowledge is only useful if it moves. What happened to her? She died when I was 14. I was the only one who wanted the journal. A pause. My mother thought it was old-fashioned. My brother thought it was worthless. I thought... She stopped. What did you think? She was quiet for a moment. I thought she knew things that were worth knowing, and that someone should hold on to them. Caleb looked at the ceiling of the stable, at the places where the boards had warped and the light came through in thin silver lines. River would have died tonight, he said. Without you. Maybe. Not maybe. Eliza didn't argue with him. She just turned another page and kept reading, and Caleb stayed where he was, and the night went on around them, and River breathed in his stall, and it was enough. Saturday brought something nobody had planned for. It started with Martha Foss, but Garrett's wife, who arrived mid-morning with a sick calf in the back of her wagon and the expression of a woman who was embarrassed to be there but had run out of other options. Garrett doesn't know I came, she said immediately, as if that needed to be established. I want that understood. It's understood, Eliza said. Martha looked at her for a moment. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, broad-shouldered and practical, who had formed her opinions over decades of frontier life and didn't abandon them easily. But she also had a calf that had stopped eating 2 days ago, and her own pragmatism was stronger than her husband's skepticism. Garrett says you're using kitchen medicine, Martha said. He says it's foolish. He came by Thursday, Eliza said. I know. He told me. Martha glanced toward the stable. He also told me 3 of your horses stood up. Eliza didn't say anything. She simply walked to the back of the wagon and looked at the calf, ran her hands gently over its neck, checked its eyes, pressed lightly along its side. The calf was young, maybe 6 weeks, lying flat in a nest of straw Martha had arranged in the wagon bed. How long since it last ate? Day and a half, maybe 2 days. Is it from the pasture near the creek? Martha blinked. The east pasture, yes. How did you... I'll need to make a smaller batch. The proportions are different for calves, and I'll have to adjust for the age. Eliza was already walking toward the bunkhouse. Bring him inside. Caleb can help you lift him. Caleb, who had been watching all of this from the stable doorway, came forward without being asked. Martha watched him come and said quietly, so only he could hear, She always like this? More or less, Caleb said. Garrett's going to be annoyed. Garrett's annoyed by a lot of things. He reached into the wagon and got his arms under the calf carefully. Help me with the back legs. Martha helped, and she stayed for most of the morning, which Caleb suspected she hadn't planned on, sitting on the fence rail while Eliza treated the calf and asking careful, specific questions about the medicine, what was in it, how it worked, how long it took. Eliza answered all of them with the same direct thoroughness she brought to everything, and somewhere around noon, Martha Foss stopped looking like a woman who was embarrassed to be there. By the time she drove her wagon back home, the calf was sitting up. It wasn't recovered, not in one morning, but it was sitting up, which it hadn't been doing when it arrived, and Martha knew the difference. She paused the wagon at the end of the entrance road and looked back at the ranch for a moment, and Caleb, standing at the gate, couldn't read her expression exactly, but she lifted her hand in something that was closer to a salute than a wave. He raised his hand back. Sunday, the 8th horse stood up. Caleb was the one who saw it first. He had come in early, before Eliza was awake, because he always came in early. The habit of 19 years was not a thing that changed easily. And there was Flint, the young stallion who 5 days ago had been the one Caleb had been most afraid of losing, standing at the front of his stall with his head up and his ears forward and his dark eyes tracking Caleb's movement with the calm alertness of a healthy horse. Caleb stopped walking. He stood in the center aisle of the stable and looked at the horse for a long moment. The early morning light came through the east wall cracks in pale, thin strips. The stable smelled like horses and hay and the lingering herbal scent of the medicine. Everything was quiet except for the soft sounds of animals breathing, shifting weight, the occasional flick of a tail. 8 horses standing, 5 still down. 2 weeks of work ahead, maybe more, 1 already lost. He should have felt more. He knew that. The kind of man in stories would have felt overwhelming relief, would have leaned against the stall door and let something release. What Caleb actually felt was quieter than that. A small, careful thing, like a match being struck in a very large room, not enough to light the room, but enough to see by. He went back inside and started the fire for coffee. He set out 2 mugs without thinking about it, which he noticed after he'd done it and didn't undo. When Eliza came downstairs 20 minutes later, sleep rumpled and squinting, she stopped when she saw 2 mugs on the table. She didn't say anything about it. She just sat down, wrapped both hands around the mug he slid toward her, and looked out the window toward the stable. "Flint's up," Caleb said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and for a moment neither of them had anything to say, which was all right. Some things didn't need saying yet. They just needed sitting with. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, the Texas morning gathered itself and kept going, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had. And inside the kitchen that had been empty for a very long time, 2 mugs sat on the table, and that was already something different. The 2 mugs on the table became a quiet habit neither of them discussed. Caleb started the fire. Eliza came downstairs. The coffee was ready by the time she reached the kitchen, and they sat on opposite sides of the table and talked about the horses, or didn't talk at all, and then went about the work of the day. It wasn't comfortable exactly. There was still too much unfamiliarity between them for comfort, but it had settled into something functional, which was its own kind of progress. The second week of treatment moved differently than the first. The first week had been pure crisis, fire and urgency, and the specific exhaustion of people trying to stop something from getting worse. The second week was slower, and in some ways harder, because slowness leaves room for doubt. The horses that were standing needed daily maintenance doses. The 5 still down needed the full treatment twice a day. And progress, when it came in increments so small that some mornings Caleb had to look very carefully to confirm it was real. Caesar was his biggest concern. The old horse had accepted the treatment reliably, had let his fever break and come down on day 4, had even shown a flicker of his old personality, pinning his ears at Caleb when Caleb moved too slowly with the morning feed, but he was not standing. 9 days into treatment, and Caesar remained on his side, breathing steadily, eating what they brought him, but not getting up. Eliza said nothing alarming about it. She examined him every morning with the same thorough attention she gave all the animals, checked his temperature, observed his breathing, assessed his muscle response, and made notes in the margins of her grandmother's journal in her own handwriting. But Caleb had learned to read her silences as much as her words, and the particular quality of silence she kept about Caesar was one that carried weight. On the 10th morning, he finally asked her directly. They were in the stable together, Eliza crouched beside Caesar, running her hands along his hindquarters. Caleb standing a few feet back with his arms folded. "Tell me what you're not saying about him," he said. She didn't look up immediately. Her hands kept moving, methodical and slow. "I'm not saying anything." Eliza. She sat back on her heels, looked at Caesar, then at Caleb. "He's old. You know he's old. The treatment is working and his blood is clearing. His temperature has been stable for 5 days. But his body is spending everything it has on fighting the toxin, and there isn't a lot of reserve left over for, Mum," she paused, "for the other things, the things that come with being 23 years old." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the sickness might not be what takes him. I'm saying the sickness has weakened him significantly, and we won't know how much until he either stands or doesn't." She looked at the horse again. Her voice stayed even, but something in it was careful. "I'm still fighting for him. I want you to know that. I know you are. I just want you to be—" "I know," he said, more gently this time. "I know." He crouched down beside Caesar and pressed his palm flat against the horse's neck, the way he'd been doing since that first pale morning when all he could do was sit in the stable and wait. Caesar's ear twitched toward him. His breath came steadily. He was still there, still fighting in the quiet way that old animals fight, without dramatics, without surrender, just by continuing to breathe. "Come on, old man," Caleb said quietly. "Don't quit on me yet." The storm came without much warning on the 11th night. Texas in summer didn't always give warnings. The sky could be clear at supper and wrecked by midnight. And this particular storm was the kind that came in fast and mean, the leading edge of it slamming into the ranch like a door being kicked open. Caleb woke to thunder that rattled the bedroom window in its frame. And before he was fully conscious, he was already moving, the old instinct of a man who had lived on open land long enough to know that weather was something you met, not something you waited out. He pulled on his boots in the dark hallway and was reaching for his coat when Eliza's door opened. She was already dressed. She had her satchel over her shoulder. "The stable roof," she said. She'd been on the ranch 11 days, and she already knew which parts of it were precarious. The left side of the stable roof had been sagging since April. 3 boards sprung loose at the north end, where the original nails had rusted through. Caleb had meant to repair it twice and hadn't gotten to it. He hadn't gotten to it because the horses got sick, and then there was no time. "I know," he said. They went out into the storm together. It was worse than Caleb had expected. The rain came sideways, driven by a southwest wind that had real force behind it, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sundown. The kind of cold that wasn't dangerous in summer, except that it was sudden. And sudden cold was exactly what his compromised horses didn't need. He could hear the stable before he could see it clearly, the boards groaning under the wind. And then the lightning came, and for one white, comprehensive second, he saw the full picture. The left side of the roof had gone. Not all of it. 3 or 4 boards still clung at the peak, but enough of it that the north end of the stable was open to the sky, rain pouring directly down into the stalls below. Which stalls were on the north end, Caleb knew without thinking. Rivers. And Caesar's. He was running before the lightning faded. Inside the stable, the noise was enormous. Rain hammering the remaining roof, horses in the southern stalls moving restlessly, and from the north end a sound that drove every other thought out of Caleb's head. He skidded around the corner of the aisle, and the lantern he'd brought swung wildly, and for a moment he couldn't parse what he was seeing. Caesar was convulsing. The old horse was on his side, which was where he'd been, but now his whole body was shaking in long, violent shudders, his legs moving in the involuntary cycling that Caleb recognized from one other horse years ago, that had not survived what came next. Rain was coming straight down on him through the open roof, the water ice cold and relentless, pooling in the straw around him. Caesar! Eliza pushed past Caleb into the stall. She went down on her knees in the wet straw without hesitating, both hands on the horse, and her face in the swinging lantern light was tight and focused in a way Caleb had not seen before. Not her usual focused calm, but something harder, something that knew it was working against a clock. "We have to move him," she said. "Right now. He's convulsing. You can't move a horse that's... He's convulsing because he's freezing. The cold has undone 4 days of temperature stability in 10 minutes. If he stays under that hole in the roof, he is going to die tonight, Caleb." She looked up at him. Rain was dripping off her hair. "I need you to help me move him. Now." Caleb had moved horses before, sick and healthy, under all kinds of circumstances. He knew it was hard work under good conditions. Under these conditions, a 23-year-old horse in convulsions, a collapsed roof overhead, sideways rain, no light except the lantern. It was something close to impossible. He went into the stall. What followed was 20 minutes that he would never fully be able to describe to anyone afterward, partly because it was chaotic and physical in the way that left no space for observation, and partly because some part of him was somewhere outside his own body watching it happen and still not quite believing it was real. They got Caesar moving by degrees, Caleb managing the horse's weight from behind with both arms, Eliza at the head, guiding and speaking to the animal in a low voice that never stopped. Not singing this time, just talking, steady and constant, a voice for the horse to follow through the confusion of cold and sickness and noise. Caesar's legs didn't cooperate. His body was not fully in his control. Twice Caleb nearly went down under the horse's weight, and once Eliza slipped on the wet straw and caught herself on the stall rail with a sharp intake of breath that told him she'd hit hard. "You all right?" he called over the rain. "Keep going," she said. They got him to the south end of the stable, into a corner stall that still had its roof and was out of the direct wind. They got blankets on him. Caleb had 4 in the storage chest, heavy wool, smelling of cedar and old use, and Eliza immediately began working on warming him more deliberately, using a method from her grandmother's journal that involved warm water applications and a specific pressure along the horse's neck that seemed counterintuitive to Caleb, but that he'd stopped second-guessing. Outside, the storm went on being a storm. The thunder came in long, rolling sequences, and the rain didn't ease for another hour. Inside the south end of the stable, the lantern light was steady, and the space was close and smelled of wet wool and horse, and the particular herbal sharpness of the emergency treatment Eliza was preparing with hands that were red with cold. Caleb held the lantern. He held it steady for 40 minutes while she worked, which was the most useful thing he could do, and he focused on doing it well. "His temperature?" he asked at one point. "Still dropping." Her voice was flat, working voice. "But slower." "Slower good?" "Slower is better than fast." She kept moving. "Talk to him." "I told you I don't care if you sing or not. Just talk to him. He knows your voice." Caleb looked down at Caesar. The horse's eyes were open, tracking him with a look that Caleb could only describe as exhausted and aware. Not confused, not gone, just terribly, terribly tired. "Hey," Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You're being incredibly difficult. You know that?" He crouched down. 23 years I've known you, and you've never made a single thing easy. I don't know why I expected tonight to be different." Caesar's ear moved, just barely. "You are not dying in a flood," Caleb said. "I'm not going to let that happen. It's undignified. You're a better horse than that." Eliza from the other side made a quiet sound, not quite a laugh, something that might have become one if the night had been less serious. They stayed in that stall for hours. At some point, the storm began to pull back, the thunder moving east, the rain settling from violence to something more ordinary. The temperature stopped dropping. Caleb was aware of the cold in his own body by then, soaked through, his back aching from crouching, his hands numb in a way that was inconvenient but not dangerous. He noticed that Eliza had stopped shivering, which probably meant she'd moved past the shivering stage into something that was about willpower rather than temperature, and he filed that observation under things he would be annoyed about later. Around 2 in the morning, Caesar's shaking stopped. Not gradually. It was more like a tide going out, the tremors becoming less frequent, then less severe, and then simply absent. His breathing slowed from the ragged, effortful pattern of the past hours to something that was still not normal but was at least sustainable. Eliza sat back and put both hands on her thighs and let out a breath that had been held for a very long time. Caleb didn't say anything. He just looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at him, and the rain outside was now just rain. "His temperature is coming up," Eliza said finally. Her voice was tired in a way he hadn't heard from her before. "Slowly, but it's moving the right direction." "Is he going to make it through the night?" She considered the horse for a long moment, the kind of consideration that was honest, not reassuring. "I think so, but one of us needs to stay with him." "I'll stay," Caleb said. "We can take turns." "I'll stay," he said again. "Go inside. You're cold." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she looked at herself, soaked, hands red, sitting in wet straw at 2 in the morning, and made the pragmatic decision of a woman who understood that being useful tomorrow required not destroying yourself tonight. "Wake me at 4, she said. "I'll take the rest of the night." "Fine." She gathered her things and stood, and for a moment she paused at the stall entrance and looked back at Caleb, sitting in the straw beside the old horse with the lantern beside him, and she opened her mouth as if she was going to say something. She didn't. Whatever it was, she kept it. He heard her footsteps going toward the house, steady and unhurried, and then the soft thud of the back door closing, and then there was just the rain and the stable and Caesar's breathing and the lantern burning down. Caleb pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them, and sat in that particular stillness that comes after a crisis, when the adrenaline has cleared and left behind only the truth of the situation, what it was, what it had almost been, what was still uncertain. He had not been afraid very often in his adult life, or more accurately, he had been afraid many times and had gotten good at not letting it show or even acknowledging it to himself. But tonight had cracked something in that habit, because there had been a moment, one specific moment, right after the lightning showed him the open roof and the convulsing horse, where he had been certain that Caesar was going to die, certain that he was going to watch it happen and be unable to stop it. And then a woman in a gray dress with a satchel over her shoulder had gone down into the wet straw without hesitating, and he had found himself following her lead, and the certainty had shifted. That was the thing he kept coming back to, sitting in the straw at 2 in the morning. Not gratitude exactly, something more unsettling than gratitude. More like the disorientation of realizing that you've been doing something alone for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to not be alone, and then suddenly being reminded. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He stayed with Caesar until 4, as he'd said he would. When Eliza came back out, dry and awake, she brought 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without comment. He took it. Their hands were both cold. Neither of them mentioned that. "He's stable," Caleb said. Temperature's almost back. She crouched down and checked the horse, her hands moving through the same examination routine he'd now watched so many times he could have narrated it. She nodded. Go sleep. He went. What? Morning arrived with the particular cruelty of mornings after hard nights. Bright and indifferent, the sky washed clean by the storm, the air smelling of wet earth and a freshness that felt almost offensive given what the night had been. Caleb slept 3 hours and woke with the kind of alertness that isn't refreshment, but urgency. And he was back in the stable before he'd fully registered being awake. Eliza was still there. She'd pulled the wooden stool from the supply corner and was sitting beside Caesar with her grandmother's journal open and a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting long enough to be cold. Caesar's head was up. Not high. He was still exhausted, still fragile, but up. And his eyes, when he tracked Caleb's entrance, had the specific quality of alertness that Caleb had not seen in them for nearly 2 weeks. Caleb stopped in the aisle. He's been like this since about an hour ago, Eliza said. She didn't look up from the journal, but there was something different in her voice, a controlled quality, like she was holding something at a careful distance. Caleb came forward slowly and crouched at the stall entrance. Caesar looked at him. That ear moved again, more decisively this time, rotating forward with something approaching interest. Hey, Caleb said. The horse exhaled through his nose in that low, rumbling way that horses do when they're relaxed. It was the most Caesar-like sound Caleb had heard from him in 11 days. He pressed his forehead against the stall rail and stayed there for a moment. The wood was cool and solid and smelled of old timber and horsehair and all the years that had accumulated in this stable, and he stayed there until he was sure his face was doing something appropriate. Caleb, Eliza said. Yeah. He tried to stand about 40 minutes ago. He lifted his head. Did he make it? Halfway. He got his front legs under him, then decided against it. She finally looked up from the journal. But he tried. He wanted to. Caleb looked at the old horse. Stubborn, he said, and his voice was rough in a way he couldn't entirely control. Told you. Stubborn his whole life. Ishem. The roof took 2 days to repair. Caleb did most of it himself, up on the ladder with new lumber he'd driven into town to buy the morning after the storm. He was not a particularly skilled carpenter, and it showed. The repair was functional rather than beautiful, the boards not perfectly aligned, the nails driven with more force than finesse. But it held. He tested every board by hand before he came down, and it held. On the second day of repairs, somewhere around mid-afternoon, he became aware that Eliza was watching him from the ground. She had finished the midday treatment round and was standing with her arms folded and an expression he'd come to recognize as her thinking face, not blank, but directed inward, working through something. What? He called down. Nothing. She looked away. You're doing the face. She looked back up. What face? The face where you're thinking about something you haven't decided to say yet. She was quiet for a moment, then, You've been up there 4 hours. I'm aware. Have you eaten today? He thought about it. Coffee counts. It does not. She walked toward the house. Come down in 10 minutes. He came down in 12, which was close enough. She had put cornbread and cold ham on the table, and she was sitting across from him drinking water when he came in, not coffee. He'd noticed she switched to water in the afternoons, probably to manage the sleep deprivation more carefully, which was a more intelligent approach than his own strategy of simply ignoring the sleep deprivation. They ate. The kitchen was warm from the afternoon sun through the south window, and outside he could hear the horses. most of them outside now in the near pasture, which still seemed almost miraculous to him, the sound of horses moving in open air after 2 weeks of stable sounds. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. "You're asking permission now?" "It's a more personal question than I usually ask." He looked at her. "Go ahead." She wrapped both hands around her glass. "Why did you stay on this ranch after everything started going wrong? The drought years, the bank problems. Garrett Foss mentioned some of it. Not to me directly, but I overheard enough. You could have sold. You could have started somewhere else." She wasn't pressing, just genuinely asking, in the direct way she did most things. "Why stay?" Caleb looked at the table for a moment. It was a question he'd answered in his own head many times, in many versions, but he'd never had to put it into words for another person. "My father broke himself building this place," he said finally. Not in a romantic way. He wasn't well the last few years. His heart. He kept working past when he should have stopped because he didn't know how to stop. And I watched him do it, and I couldn't. He stopped. I couldn't let it come to nothing, even when it made more sense to let it go. He looked out the window toward the pasture. "That probably sounds like stubbornness." "It sounds like loyalty," Eliza said. "There's not always much difference." She considered this seriously the way she considered most things. "No," she said. "I suppose not." He looked at her. "Your turn." "My turn for what?" "Why Dallas? Why the agency? You could have stayed in Tennessee." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "There wasn't anything to stay for. My father's farm was gone, my mother had gone to live with my brother, and I—" She stopped. Tried again. "I had a situation in Nashville, an understanding with someone that turned out not to be an understanding at all." She said it flatly, without drama, which somehow made it feel more serious than drama would have. "I needed somewhere that wasn't there. This seemed as sensible as anywhere else." "That's a practical way to think about it." "I'm a practical person." "I've noticed." He paused. "I'm sorry. About Nashville." She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not gratitude, not dismissal. Something in between. "I'm not," she said after a moment. "Not anymore." And then she picked up her glass and finished her water and stood up, and the conversation was over in that decisive way she had of closing things when she was done with them. But she left her glass on the table, which she usually didn't, and Caleb had the sense that the conversation hadn't been entirely finished so much as set down carefully for later. Caesar stood up on the 14th day, not with assistance, not part way and then back down. He gathered himself in the quiet of the early morning, with Caleb and Eliza both in the stable for the first treatment of the day, and he simply stood. The process was not graceful. His front legs went first, then his hindquarters, and there was a moment where his balance was genuinely uncertain, and Caleb took an involuntary step forward. But Caesar found his feet. He shook himself, a full-body shudder from nose to tail, the way a horse shakes off water. Then he turned and looked at Caleb with an expression of mild indignation, as if to say, "I don't know what all the fuss was about." Eliza made a sound beside him. Caleb turned and found her with one hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes bright in a way he had not seen before. Not crying, but close to something adjacent to it, the particular overwhelm of relief that has been held at bay too long. She blinked it back quickly, dropped her hand, and busied herself with the medicine kit. Told you, she said, her voice not quite steady. Last argument. Caleb looked at Caesar, standing, upright, 23 years old, and impossibly alive, and something in his chest that had been braced for 11 days finally let go. Yeah, he said, you did. The morning light was coming through the east wall now, through the gaps between the boards, and through the new section of roof where the boards were lighter in color than the old ones. The stable smelled like horses and medicine and old wood, and something that wasn't hope exactly, but was close enough. Outside, in the near pasture, the rest of the herd was moving in the early light, grazing, drifting, their outlines familiar and solid against the pale Texas morning. The strange fever that had moved through them like a slow catastrophe was retreating, driven back by 2 weeks of relentless care and a dead woman's knowledge, and two people who had found, unexpectedly, that they worked better together than either of them had any reason to anticipate. Caleb stayed in the stable a long time that morning, longer than necessary. He moved through the stalls doing the morning check, the same routine he'd done every morning for 19 years. But everything felt fractionally different, like a photograph that's the same composition as before, but the light has shifted. When he came out, Eliza was at the back porch, washing her hands at the basin, her sleeves rolled up, her hair loose from its pins the way it always was by mid-morning. She looked tired. She had been tired for 2 weeks and hadn't complained about it once, which was either admirable or stubborn, and he suspected it was both. I need to fix the east pasture fence, he said, before we let the recovered horses out there. Some of the posts shifted in the storm. She dried her hands. All right. There's also the creek. I need to find that plant, root it out so it doesn't start this again. I'll show you what to look for. I documented it. He nodded. There was a list growing in his head. Repairs, precautions, things that had gone undone during the crisis and now needed doing. The ranch was still standing, damaged, patched, stretched thin, but standing. Eliza, he said. She looked at him. He wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to say. There were several options, and none of them felt precise enough. He settled for the one that was simply true. You didn't have to do any of this. She considered him for a moment, then she said, Yes, I did. And the way she said it didn't leave room for argument, not dismissing the statement, but answering it from somewhere firmer than obligation. Like it had been a choice, and she had made it, and she wasn't interested in being thanked for something she'd chosen freely. She went inside. Caleb stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the ranch, but the repaired stable, the near pasture full of horses that were supposed to be dead, the fence line that needed work, the long Texas sky going gold at the edge. It wasn't what it had been 2 weeks ago. It wasn't whole yet. There was still a lot of broken and a lot of work and a long road to anything resembling the ranch his father had imagined. But it was alive, and so was he, in some way that he hadn't quite been before. That was something he thought he'd need some time to understand. He suspected he had it, time. More of it than he'd expected to have, standing in the stable at dawn 2 weeks ago watching his horses fall. He pulled his hat down and went to fix the fence. The fence took 3 days to fix properly. Caleb had told himself it would take 1, maybe 2 if the post holes were rocky, but the storm had done more damage than was visible from the porch. 3 sections of the east pasture fence had shifted badly enough that the wire had pulled loose from the posts, and 2 of the corner posts themselves had heaved out of the ground at angles that made the whole line unreliable. He worked through it methodically, the way he worked through most things. Not fast, but steady, not stopping until each section was done before moving to the next. Eliza came out on the second afternoon with water and the information that he'd missed lunch. I didn't miss it, he said, tamping the dirt around a new post with the heel of his boot. I postponed it. The distinction matters to you? Somewhat. He tested the post, still a little loose. He tamped again. How are the horses? The maintenance doses are going well. I'm going to start reducing Rivers by half tomorrow. He's been fully stable for 4 days, and I don't want to give him more than he needs. What about Caesar? She handed him the water canteen. Caesar is eating everything I put in front of him and has started pinning his ears at the other horses again when they get too close to his stall. So I'd say he's recovering his personality. That's a polite way to say he's being difficult. He's being Caesar, she said, which is the same thing. Caleb drank and handed back the canteen and looked along the fence line at what was left to do. Another full section, maybe more. The wire was old in places and had developed rust at the joints he hadn't noticed until he was right up close with it. This whole fence needs to be replaced eventually, he said, more to himself than to her. How long has it been up? Since my father built it. Some of the wire is original. He pulled at a section of it, and it gave slightly in a way that good wire shouldn't. He put it up in 71. That's 23 years. Eliza looked at the fence, then at the pasture beyond it, where Flint and 2 of the mares were grazing in the late afternoon light. Well, she said, everything that holds long enough eventually needs replacing. That's not a failure. It's just time. He glanced at her. She was looking at the horses, not at him, and her expression was ordinary. Just a woman stating a practical observation about fence maintenance, but the words sat differently than fence maintenance. He went back to tamping the post. She stayed a while, not helping exactly. There wasn't much for a second person to do with fence work, but present in the way she had sometimes been in the stable, sitting nearby while he worked, which he had stopped finding strange sometime in the second week. It was the kind of company that didn't demand anything. He'd forgotten that kind existed. Chugged. The visitors started coming the week after Caesar stood up. Martha Foss had been the first, with her calf, but Martha had come in the middle of the crisis when Eliza was already consumed with the horses. The visitors who came after the herd recovered were different in character. They came with news of what they'd heard, which had apparently traveled further and faster than Caleb had any reason to expect. The first was a man named Douglas Pruitt from the settlement 3 miles south, who arrived on a Tuesday morning with a sick milk cow tied to the back of his wagon and a skeptical, sideways manner of speaking that told Caleb he'd been argued into coming by his wife and wasn't entirely comfortable about it. I heard you had some trouble with your horses, Pruitt said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. We did, Caleb said. And they recovered. 13 out of 14. Pruitt absorbed this. Looked at the cow. She's been off her feed for a week, stopped giving milk 3 days ago. Doc Harlan came out and said she might have a blockage, gave me some powders that didn't do anything. He finally looked directly at Caleb. I heard there's a woman here who... She's in the stable, Caleb said. Come on. Eliza looked at the cow the same way she'd looked at Martha's calf, quickly, thoroughly, with her hands doing as much reading as her eyes. She asked Pruitt the same kind of questions she'd asked Caleb 3 weeks ago. Where the cow grazed, what water source, how long in that pasture, whether any other animals on the property were affected. Pruitt answered with the wariness of a man who had been burned by false confidence before. You think you know what it is? He said when she'd finished. I have a strong suspicion. She didn't dress it up. The same plant that affected Mr. Ashford's horses grows along most of the creek systems in this part of the county. If your cow has been grazing near Decker Creek, she's likely been accumulating the same toxin. My east pasture runs along Decker Creek, Pruitt said slowly. She grazes there most mornings. Then yes, I think I can help her. Eliza straightened up. I'll need 2 days to prepare enough medicine for her size. You can leave her here or come back. I'll leave her, Pruitt said, in the tone of a man making a decision he wasn't fully certain about. He looked at Caleb. You vouch for this? Caleb looked at his 13 horses in the pasture and at Caesar visible through the stable doorway, standing and eating and being difficult in the particular way that meant he was fine. Yeah, he said, I vouch for it. Pruitt untied the cow from his wagon without further argument. He came back 4 days later to find her standing in the south paddock eating grass with the focused enthusiasm of an animal that had been ill and had recovered and intended to make up for lost time. He stood at the paddock fence for a long moment, looking at her, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. What do I owe you? He said to Eliza, who was beside him. Nothing this time, she said. I'm still learning what works at scale. Your cow helped me understand the dosing for cattle better than I did before. Pruitt looked at her. He was a taciturn man and not given to speeches, but something moved across his face that was more than simple relief. My family's lived off that cow for 2 years, he said. My youngest is 4. She drinks the milk every morning. Eliza nodded. I know, she said. That's why I worked quickly. He put his hat back on and led his cow to the wagon and drove south. And he left behind him the particular quality of silence that follows when someone has been helped in a way they didn't expect and hasn't yet found the words for. That evening, Caleb watched Eliza make a new entry in the margins of her grandmother's journal. Careful, precise handwriting noting the cow's symptoms, the dosing, the timeline of recovery. The journal's margins were filling up with her own observations now, added to the old ones, the 2 generations of handwriting layered together on the pages. You should have charged him, Caleb said. I told you, I learned from his cow. Eliza, you can't treat every animal in the county for free. She looked up. I didn't say every animal for free. I said this one, this time. She looked back at the journal. He has a 4-year-old daughter who drinks that milk every morning. Caleb looked at her for a moment. He thought about arguing the practicality of it further and decided it wasn't the right conversation for tonight. All right, he said. She wrote another line in the margin. But eventually, he said. Eventually, she agreed, without looking up. Word traveled in the way that word traveled in that part of Texas. Not through newspapers or official channels, but through the network of people who talked to each other at the supply store, at the well, across fence lines during the small negotiations of neighboring life. By the end of July, Caleb had stopped being surprised by wagons appearing at the end of his entrance road with sick animals in them. What had surprised him was the variety. He'd expected horses and cows, the valuable animals, the ones people couldn't afford to lose. But they brought chickens with respiratory illness, a pair of goats that had gone off their feet, a dog belonging to a widow named Clara Eames who lived 6 miles north and had driven out herself alone on a road that wasn't good for solo travel because the dog was old and she had nothing else. I know it's just a dog, Clara said, standing in Caleb's yard holding the animal wrapped in a blanket. Her chin lifted in the defensive way of someone expecting to be told their concern isn't important. It's not just a dog, Eliza said before Caleb could respond. Let me look at him. She spent an hour with the dog. A different kind of examination than the livestock, adapted, patient. The dog was old and arthritic and had a respiratory infection that Eliza was honest about not being certain she could treat fully. He's very old, she told Clara. I can make him more comfortable. I can treat the infection. Whether his body has the strength to respond, That I can't promise." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Can I stay while you treat him?" "Of course." Clara stayed 2 days, sleeping in the spare room, sitting with her dog through his treatments with the focused attention of someone who had decided to be present for whatever happened. Caleb found her in the kitchen on the second morning making breakfast, not asking, just doing it. And when he came downstairs, she handed him a plate without ceremony and said, "I hope that's all right. I needed something to do with my hands." "It's more than all right," he said. The eggs were better than his. The dog responded to treatment slowly and imperfectly. He didn't recover the way the horses had recovered, didn't come back to anything like full health. But the infection receded and his breathing eased, and on the morning Clara left, he was walking under his own power, slowly, which was more than he'd been doing when she arrived. She settled him carefully in her wagon and then stood in Caleb's yard looking at Eliza with an expression that was a lot of things at once. "I want to pay you," she said. "There's no charge," Eliza said. Clara's mouth pressed together. "I'm not a charity case." "I know you're not." Eliza met her eyes. "Clara, you drove 6 miles alone on a bad road with a sick dog because he matters to you. That's not a charity case. That's a person who takes their responsibilities seriously." She paused. "Come back if he has trouble." Clara reached into the wagon and brought out a cloth-wrapped package that she pressed into Eliza's hands. "Preserves," she said. "I made them in May. It's not payment. I wanted to give you something." She drove away without waiting for a response, which seemed to be her way of handling things that mattered too much. Inside the cloth were 6 jars of preserves, peach, blackberry, and something dark red that turned out to be wild plum. Eliza lined them up on the kitchen windowsill where the light came through them in the mornings and made them glow like stained glass. Caleb looked at them and didn't say anything, but he thought about what Garrett Foss had called it, kitchen medicine. And the gap between that and what he was watching seemed wider every day. August came in hot and stayed hot, the way August in Texas always did, as if the land itself was reminding you not to get comfortable. The maintenance treatments had wound down for the herd. All 13 horses were fully recovered, eating and working and being their particular selves. But the work hadn't decreased. If anything, it had expanded, because the visitors kept coming, and Eliza kept treating, and the operation had grown in a way that had not been planned and was not exactly organized. Caleb started noticing the practical problems before Eliza did, or at least before she acknowledged them. The herbs she needed were increasingly difficult to gather in sufficient quantities from the immediate vicinity. She'd been ranging further on her morning collection trips, sometimes coming back after noon instead of by 10, and he'd seen her studying the creek maps he kept in the study desk with the focused attention of someone doing resource planning. The medicine making took time and space that were currently improvised. The fire ring, the kitchen table, the fence rail as a drying rack. It worked for 1 or 2 animals at a time, but 3 animals simultaneously had nearly overwhelmed the setup last week, when Pruitt had brought a second cow and a farmer named Hendricks had shown up the same day with a sick mule, and the journal, her grandmother's journal, was running out of margin space. Caleb watched all of this accumulate for about 2 weeks before he started doing anything about it, because he understood without being told that whatever shape this took needed to be her decision and her design. He wasn't going to build something for her without knowing what she wanted. But he also wasn't going to ignore a practical problem because it was adjacent to a conversation he didn't know how to start. He started by expanding the fire ring setup, built a proper stone surround with a grate that could handle 2 pots simultaneously instead of 1, sourced from the blacksmith in town who owed him a favor from last year. He built a proper drying rack near the back porch, long and south-facing to catch the afternoon sun, instead of the fence rail that worked but was inconvenient. He cleared and leveled the old storage shed at the back of the property, which had been used for broken equipment and general accumulation for at least a decade, and spent 2 days hauling out everything that wasn't useful. He didn't explain what he was doing. He just did it. Eliza noticed. He could tell because she altered her morning route to pass the shed on her way to the fire ring, and she stopped once and stood in the doorway looking at the cleared space without saying anything, and then continued on. But something in her manner that day had a considering quality to it, the look of a person running calculations. The conversation happened on a Saturday evening, sitting on the back porch in the relative cool of sundown, the preserve jars glowing orange through the kitchen window, the sounds of the horses settled for the night drifting from the stable. "You cleared the shed," Eliza said. "Needed clearing. You also built a better fire setup, and the drying rack. Those things needed doing." She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, I'm not building anything until you tell me what you want," he said. "I'm just preparing the possibility." He looked out at the shed. "You could have a proper workspace. The space is there. It would need shelving, a work table, proper ventilation for when you're brewing the stronger medicines. Maybe a place to keep the journal and your notes separate from the kitchen table." She was quiet long enough that he started to wonder if he'd misjudged the conversation. "It would take time to build it properly," she said finally. "I have time. Work steady enough I can do an hour or two a day. It would cost materials." "Some. I can manage it." Another silence, then, "The journal is running out of room. I've been thinking about copying her notes into a new book, organized differently, by animal type, by symptom rather than chronology. It would be easier to use when someone comes in with something I haven't treated before." "That sounds like a reason to have a workspace," he said. "It does," she said, and that was all. But that night she came downstairs after supper and sat at the kitchen table with a fresh piece of paper and spent 2 hours sketching something. Not drawing exactly, more mapping, the way you map something you're planning. She didn't show it to him, but she left it on the table when she went to bed, not put away, and in the morning when Caleb came down and started the coffee, he looked at it without touching it. It was a layout. A floor plan for the shed, where the shelving would go, the ventilation cutout for the east wall, the workbench orientation relative to the light. Neat, practical, already thought through. He put the coffee on and didn't say anything. When she came downstairs, she looked at the paper, then at him. "The east wall cutout needs to face southeast," she said, "not due east. The morning light comes in at an angle and you lose it by 10 if the opening faces straight." "I know how the light moves on this property," he said. "I know you do." He put a mug in front of her. She sat down and wrapped her hands around it. And outside the morning was already bright and promised to be another hard August day. And the horses were beginning to stir. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary morning, something had shifted in a way that hadn't been named yet, but that both of them could feel, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. The shed took 3 weeks to build into something proper. Caleb worked at it evenings mostly, after the day's other work was done, which meant he was usually at it in the fading light with a lantern for the last hour. He built the shelving himself from lumber he'd had left over from the roof repair, and supplemented with what he bought in town. He was a better carpenter than he'd given himself credit for. Or more accurately, he was a more patient one than he used to be, willing to redo something that wasn't right rather than accepting the approximate answer. Eliza stopped in most evenings on her way back from the fire ring, not to help but to assess, offering occasional observations that were technically suggestions, but delivered with the directness of someone who knew what they needed and didn't see the point of being indirect about it. The shelf depth needed to be wider on the bottom row for the larger pots. The workbench height needed to be 3 inches higher than standard because she was taller than average, and the standard height would destroy her back over long work sessions. The ventilation cutout needed a shutter that could be closed in bad weather. He built everything to her specifications without argument. Not because he was passive, but because she was right about all of it, and he knew the difference between someone telling him what they wanted and someone telling him what they needed. The last thing he added was something he hadn't discussed with her. He'd kept it in the back of his mind for weeks, not sure if it was the right gesture or too much. The kind of thing that could land wrong if the moment wasn't right. But the morning he finished the shed and stood in the doorway looking at the completed space, the shelves, the workbench, the ventilation shutter that opened and closed cleanly, the afternoon light coming through the southeast cutout at exactly the angle she'd specified, he went to the stable and came back with it. He hung it on the wall beside the workbench where she'd see it immediately when she came in. It was a wind chime. He'd made it himself over several evenings from the old horseshoes of Penny, the young chestnut mare he'd lost, the one he'd buried under the oak in the northeast corner. He'd cleaned the shoes, worked them until they were smooth, and hung them on twisted wire in a way that let them move against each other when the breeze came through the ventilation cutout. It wasn't refined work. The wire was irregular, and one shoe hung slightly off-center in a way that bothered him, but that he couldn't correct without starting over. But it moved cleanly in the air, and the sound it made was low and clear, the kind of sound that belonged in a working space rather than a decorative one. He didn't tell Eliza what it was made from. She found out herself the evening he showed her the finished shed. She walked through it slowly, touching the shelves, checking the workbench height, opening and closing the ventilation shutter twice. Then she stopped at the wind chime. She looked at it for a moment without touching it, then looked at Caleb. "Horseshoes," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "Pennies?" He hadn't told her. He didn't know how she knew. Maybe she'd counted the shoes in the stable. Maybe she'd noticed them missing somewhere. Maybe she'd simply understood the kind of thing he would do and worked backward from that. "Yes," he said. She looked at the chime for a long moment. A breeze came through the cutout, and the shoes moved against each other, soft and clear. "That's a good thing to do with them," she said. Her voice was level, but her hand came up and touched one of the shoes, briefly, the way you touch something that deserves to be acknowledged. They stood in the shed together in the early evening light, the chime moving gently, the shelves waiting for the jars and bundles and equipment that would fill them, the workbench clean and empty, the way the beginning of something is always clean and empty. "It's good," Eliza said, meaning the shed, meaning all of it. "It'll do," Caleb said, which was the closest he generally got to saying the same thing. It was Garrett Foss who inadvertently forced the conversation they'd been not having for weeks. He came by on a Wednesday in late August, ostensibly to return a tool he'd borrowed before the crisis, a post-hole digger he'd had since April, and stood in the yard looking at the new shed with an expression that moved through several phases of surprise before settling somewhere adjacent to uncomfortable. What is that building?" "Herbal workshop," Caleb said. Garrett looked at the shed, at the drying rack, at the organized setup near the fire ring that bore no resemblance to the improvised arrangement of 2 months ago. "Caleb," he said, lowering his voice in the way that meant he thought he was being tactful, "can I ask you something directly?" "You're going to regardless," Caleb said. Garrett set the post-hole digger against the fence. "What is the arrangement here exactly? With the woman?" He glanced toward the house. "I mean, you were supposed to get married. You went to the county office, I assume. We postponed it, Caleb said, which was true. In the chaos of the first days, the county office trip had simply never happened, and neither of them had raised it since. Circumstances intervened. I know circumstances intervened. The whole county knows circumstances intervened. Garrett folded his arms. But she's living in your house, Caleb. People are talking. People talk about everything. I'm just saying, for her sake as much as yours, it might be time to sort out what you're actually doing here. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. That's all I'm saying. I appreciate your concern, Caleb said in a tone that did not particularly suggest appreciation. Garrett picked up the post-hole digger, seemed to realize he'd just picked it up when he'd come to return it, and set it back down. She's done remarkable things, he said, and it came out with the specific weight of a man who doesn't like admitting he was wrong but understands it's required. With the animals, he waved a hand vaguely. Everything. Martha thinks very highly of her. Martha has good judgment, Caleb said. Yes, she does. Garrett cleared his throat. Well, I'll let you get back to it. He left without the post-hole digger, which Caleb noticed but didn't mention. That evening, after supper, Caleb sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Eliza had gone upstairs, thinking about what Garrett had said with more honesty than he would have allowed himself a month ago. The postponed county trip had not come up because they'd been too busy and because neither of them had pushed it, and he'd told himself that was because there were more important things to attend to. And that was true. But it was also true that the reason he hadn't pushed it was something more complicated than calendar management. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted, which was an unfamiliar condition. Caleb Ashford had generally known what he wanted. He'd wanted the ranch. He'd wanted the herd. He'd wanted to make something out of what his father had left. Those things were clear. This was less clear. He knew that the kitchen felt different with 2 mugs on the table. He knew that the evenings on the porch were something he looked forward to in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. He knew that watching Eliza work, her focused, unhurried competence, the way she treated every animal as if it mattered regardless of its value, the way she'd gone into that storm without hesitation, had changed something in how he thought about what strength looked like. But knowing things and knowing what to do with them were different problems. He sat with it. He was good at sitting with things. He went to bed without resolving it, which was also something he was good at. Recognizing when a problem needed more time rather than forcing an answer. In the morning, the 2 mugs were on the table. The coffee was ready before she came downstairs. Some things resolved themselves not in conversations but in accumulation, in the daily weight of small choices made consistently over time, until the shape of those choices became visible for what it actually was. He was starting to see the shape. He hadn't figured out yet what to do with it, but he could see it clearly, and that was further than he'd been a month ago, and for now that was enough to keep going on. Outside, the September morning was gathering itself slowly, cooler than August had been, the edge of the heat finally beginning to soften in the early hours. The horses were moving in the pasture. The new shed stood at the back of the property with Penny's horseshoes catching the first light through the southeast cutout, swaying gently, making their low, clear sound in the morning air. The ranch was alive again. And something else was alive too, quieter and less certain and not yet named, growing in the space between 2 people who had stopped pretending it wasn't there. September came in sideways, the way seasons in Texas often did. Not a clean arrival, but a gradual negotiation. The brutal heat of August retreating degree by degree until one morning you walked outside and the air had a different quality to it, something cooler at the edges, and you realized the worst was behind you without having noticed exactly when it passed. Caleb noticed it on a Thursday morning, standing at the well with the bucket, the water coming up cold the way it did when the ground temperature finally dropped. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, just feeling the air on his face, and thought about how different this morning was from the morning 7 weeks ago when he'd stood in the stable watching Caesar breathe and believed with complete certainty that everything was ending. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been wrong about several things. The question of what to do about being wrong was what occupied him as he carried the water bucket back to the house, where the kitchen window showed the warm glow of the lamp and the shadow of Eliza already moving around inside, doing whatever she did in the mornings before he came in. He'd never asked, had simply come to understand that she was a person who needed the first 20 minutes of a day to herself, which was a preference he respected because he understood it. He set the bucket on the porch step and sat down beside it and watched the ranch in the early light. The east pasture fence was solid now, the new posts bright against the weathered ones. The stable roof was patched, not beautiful but sound. The fire ring had its proper stone surround. The drying rack along the back porch held the current batch of herbs, chamomile and peppermint mostly, gathered yesterday from the creek banks where Eliza had shown him exactly which plants to take and which to leave. The shed stood at the back of the property with its southeast cutout and its shelves full of jars and its wind chime that caught the morning air when the breeze came from the right direction. None of it was what it had been before. The ranch his father had built was underneath all of it, foundation and bone. But the surface of things had changed. Some of the change was repair, things brought back to what they'd been. But some of it was different, new, altered, rearranged by the weeks that had passed and the particular pressure they'd applied. He thought about his father. The way the man had worked without stopping, past the point where stopping would have saved him. Caleb had understood it intellectually for years, the stubbornness of a man who believed the land would only hold if he held it. But he'd never entirely separated that understanding from a quieter grief, which was that his father had spent the last years of his life alone in his effort. No one working beside him, no one to hand something to when his hands were full. Caleb had inherited that pattern along with the land. He wasn't sure when he'd started to recognize it as a pattern rather than just a way of living. The back door opened and Eliza came out with 2 mugs and handed him one without ceremony and sat down on the step beside him, not close but present, and looked at the same view he'd been looking at. "You're up early," she said. "I'm always up early." "Earlier than early, then." She drank. "What are you thinking about?" "The ranch?" "Specifically?" He considered. "How different it looks now than it did 7 weeks ago." She looked at the pasture, at the horses moving in the early light, all 13 of them, Caesar among them with the unhurried authority of an old animal that has survived something and knows it. "It does look different," she said. "Better or different?" "Both," she said. "They're not the same thing." He looked at her. She was watching Caesar with an expression that was quiet and a little private, the expression she had when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say yet. He'd become good at recognizing that expression over 7 weeks. He'd become good at a lot of things he hadn't known how to read before. "Eliza," he said, "I want to talk about something." She looked at him. She had the stillness she always had when she was paying full attention, which was different from the stillness of someone waiting, more active, more directed, like a hand held open. He was not a man who talked about things naturally. He'd been alone long enough that putting interior things into exterior words felt like translation, always slightly imprecise. But he'd also learned 7 weeks ago, watching a woman go into a storm without hesitation, that the cost of not saying things was sometimes higher than the discomfort of saying them. "We never went to the county office," he said. "No," she said. "We didn't. I want to ask you something about that, but I need to say something first." He looked at the view rather than at her, which was the only way he could do this without losing the thread. When you came off that train, I was a man who had run out of options and was in the middle of losing everything. I didn't have anything good to offer you. I knew it then. I know it more clearly now. Hook Caleb. Let me finish. He wasn't sharp about it. The arrangement we had on paper, the agency, the contract, that was one thing. What's happened since is something else. And I don't want to confuse those two things. I don't want you to feel like you're held to an agreement you made before you knew what you were agreeing to. He paused. You could leave. You have grounds to. The situation you arrived into was not what you were told to expect, and no one would blame you. The morning was very quiet. The wind chime in the shed made its faint, clear sound on the air. Are you asking me to leave? Eliza said. Her voice was even, but he'd learned to hear what was underneath evenness. I'm telling you that you can, he said. Those are different things. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Do you remember what you told Caesar the night of the storm? He looked at her. What? You told him he was being incredibly difficult. She wasn't smiling exactly, but something in her voice was close to it. You told him 23 years of knowing him, and he'd never made a single thing easy. You told him you weren't going to let him die in a flood because it was undignified. She looked at her mug. I was in the stable doorway. I heard the whole thing. He hadn't known that. I thought, she said carefully, that was the most honest I'd heard you be with anything. She paused. You talk to your horses better than you talk to people. I know, he said. So talk to me like a horse. He looked at her for a moment. Then, despite everything, he almost laughed, a short, involuntary sound that he didn't quite suppress. That's an unusual request. I'm an unusual person. You are, he said, and the way it came out carried more than he intended, which he suspected she heard. He looked back at the pasture, at Caesar, who was standing near the east fence in the morning sun with all the dignity of an old horse who has earned his opinions. I don't want you to leave, he said, not because of the ranch, not because of the horses or the work or the practical necessity of having someone to manage the house, because... He stopped, tried again. Because the 2 mugs on the table every morning is the first thing in years that's felt like something rather than nothing. Because you went into a storm at midnight without anyone asking you to, for animals that weren't yours yet, and I have been thinking about that every day since. Because when I fixed that fence, I was thinking about whether it was good enough for the ranch you'd be staying on, not the ranch I was maintaining alone. He looked at her. Because I can see the shape of what this is. I've been able to see it for a while. I just needed to find words for it that weren't borrowed from somewhere else. Eliza held her mug in both hands and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not her working face, not her thinking face, not the careful neutrality she used as a default. Something more exposed than those, and more certain at the same time. Like a door open that had been closed a long time. I have a condition, she said. All right. The shed is mine. It was always going to be yours. The workshop, the practice. If people come to me with animals, that's mine to manage. My decisions on treatment, my decisions on what I charge and what I don't charge. You don't get a vote on the Clara Eameses of the situation. I didn't want to vote on Clara Eames, he said. I wanted you to be able to sustain yourself doing it, which is a different conversation. I know the difference. She looked at him steadily. I also know that you built that shed to the specifications I sketched on a piece of paper that I left on the kitchen table without asking you to build anything. And you built every shelf to the right depth and the workbench to the right height and the ventilation cut out at the right angle, and you hung Penny's shoes on the wall, and you never once asked me to acknowledge any of it." He didn't say anything. "That's the kind of person you are," she said. "I want to be clear that I see it." It was the most direct thing she'd ever said to him, and it landed with more weight than he was prepared for. He looked at the well, at the bucket, at the ordinary familiar objects of his ordinary familiar morning, which felt less ordinary right now than he could account for. "I have a condition too," he said. "Of course you do. You teach me. The medicine, the plants, the preparations, the treatments. I want to learn it properly, not just well enough to assist. If something happens to you, if you're ill or traveling, or you want to be able to continue the work," she said. "I want to be someone who can," he said, "for the animals, for the people who come here, and—" he paused, "because it's yours, and I want to understand what's yours." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he heard the wind chime again, and the horses in the pasture, and a mockingbird somewhere in the oak trees starting up its morning catalog of sounds. "All right," she said, "I'll teach you." "All right," he said. They sat with that for a moment. Two people who had said what needed saying and were now in the unfamiliar territory of what comes after. "The county office opens at 9, Eliza said. "It does." "We could go today, if you wanted to." "We could," he said. She stood up and took his empty mug along with hers and went inside, and through the kitchen window he watched her rinse both mugs at the basin in the way she did every morning. He sat on the porch step a moment longer, in the September air that was cool at the edges, and looked at his ranch. It was not the ranch his father had built. It was not the ranch it had been before the fever. It was something in between those things and something beyond them both, patched and repaired and altered, bearing the marks of everything that had happened to it. Not all the marks beautiful, some of them just evidence of hard weather and hard work, and the particular damage of nearly being lost. It was more honest than it had been before. He thought his father would have understood that. He got up and went inside to get his hat. Bam. They were married at the county office at 9:30 on a Thursday morning in September, with the county clerk as witness, and no ceremony beyond what was required, which suited them both. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Helen, who had witnessed hundreds of these transactions and brought a level of professional warmth to them that was genuine without being excessive, said the words and had them each say the words and stamped the document and shook both their hands. Outside on the county office steps, in the ordinary morning light, they stood for a moment. Eliza had worn her better dress, not her gray one, but a dark blue one he hadn't seen before, which she'd pressed the evening prior in the kitchen while he was working on fence inventory. He hadn't commented on it, and neither had she. "That was efficient," she said. "We're efficient people," he said. "We are." She looked down the main street of town, the supply store, the post office, the blacksmith, the feed operation that doubled as a social gathering point most mornings. People moved along the street doing their Thursday errands, paying them no particular attention. "Should we get supplies while we're here?" "I have a list," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not a grand moment, not the kind of thing that gets described in romantic terms, no particular shimmer or transformation, just two people looking at each other on a Thursday morning, clear-eyed, aware of exactly where they stood, which was its own kind of grace. "Let's get supplies," she said. They walked down the street together. October settled in over the ranch with a gentleness that felt almost earned, the way good weather feels after a hard season. The cottonwood along the creek line went yellow in the second week, and the mornings came in cool and smelling of grass and turned earth, and the particular sweetness of the mesquite when the air is cold enough to sharpen it. The workshop was fully operational by then. The shelves were organized by Eliza's system: treatment compounds on the upper shelves in labeled jars, raw materials below sorted by type, tools and preparation equipment on the workbench. The new journal she'd started open on its stand in the morning light. She'd spent most of September copying her grandmother's notes into the new book, reorganizing them the way she'd described, by animal type, by symptom, building a reference that was usable under pressure rather than just legible to someone who already knew what they were looking for. She added her own observations on every page. The margins Caleb's grandmother had filled with 40 years of experience were now filling again, this time with Eliza's precise handwriting. New cases, new dosing notes, adaptations for the high summer heat versus the cooler months, a running record of every animal she'd treated and how they'd responded. The new journal did not replace the old one. Both sat on the shelf beside each other, the grandmother's worn and soft-covered, Eliza's new and dark-bound. 2 volumes of the same ongoing conversation conducted across decades. Caleb studied with her in the evenings, at the kitchen table most nights. He was a practical learner. He needed to understand the reasoning behind things before the steps made sense to him, and Eliza taught accordingly, explaining the logic of each preparation rather than just the procedure. He asked questions that occasionally surprised her, the way questions do when they come from someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than simply complete a task. Why does the creek sage have to be counted by leaf rather than measured by weight? He asked one evening, looking at the relevant page in the new journal. Because the concentration of the active compound varies between plants, and a heavier leaf isn't necessarily a more potent one. The active element seems to track size more reliably than mass. She passed him the journal and pointed to a note in the margin. My grandmother figured this out after 2 inconsistent batches. She lost a treatment window on an animal because of it. He read the note. How did she know to adjust? She paid attention to what wasn't working and asked why, instead of assuming the animal was the problem. Eliza took the journal back. That's the most important thing I can teach you. When something doesn't work, don't move on until you understand why. He looked at her across the kitchen table. What? She said. Nothing. He looked back at the page she was showing him. That's also good advice for things other than medicine. She didn't respond to that immediately. Then, yes, I suppose it is. The animal Caleb remembered most from that autumn was not a horse. It was a young colt, not yet a year old, that came in on a cold October morning in the back of a wagon driven by a man named Samuel Reeves, who was about 60, weathered in the way of men who had worked outside their whole lives, and who was having difficulty looking directly at anyone when he spoke. The colt was badly underweight, not sick in the way the other animals had been sick, no fever, no toxin accumulation. He was thin in the manner of an animal that had not been fed properly for a significant period, his ribs visible, his coat dull, his energy low in a way that read more like resignation than illness. Caleb met the wagon at the gate and knew immediately what he was looking at, and felt the particular, slow anger that comes when an animal has been neglected by someone who knew better. He kept his face neutral because anger in this situation wasn't useful, and he'd learned the difference between feelings that helped and feelings that got in the way. What happened to him? He said. Reeves looked at his hands on the reins. Difficult summer, he said. I had medical costs. My wife's been ill. The feed money... He stopped. I couldn't make it stretch. Caleb looked at the colt, then at Reeves, at the man's hands, which were rough and shaking slightly in the cold, and at his coat, which was too thin for October and showed the same kind of difficult summer the colt did. He understood things about hard seasons. He understood them more than he'd used to. "Bring him in," he said. Eliza was in the workshop when he led the colt past. She came out and looked at the animal, and her expression did its focused, assessing thing, but there was something else in it this time. She looked at the colt's ribs, at his coat, at the way he moved, careful and low energy, saving himself. And then she looked at Caleb. He gave her a small nod. She went back into the workshop and came out with something different than her usual treatment preparations. A feed supplement she'd developed over the summer, a blend of ingredients that helped malnourished animals absorb nutrition more effectively than they otherwise could. It wasn't medicine exactly. It was more like care made practical. "It's going to take time," she told Reeves, "more than the fever cases. His system needs to relearn how to process properly." "How long?" "Weeks, possibly longer." She looked at the man directly. "You'll need to leave him here?" Reeves nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm not a bad man. I want you to know that." "I don't think you're a bad man," Eliza said. There was no particular softness in it, but no judgment either, just acknowledgement. "Hard seasons make hard choices. I've seen harder situations than yours this year, and I've also seen people choose worse than you did." She paused. "You brought him here. That matters." Reeves left without the colt. He drove slowly down the entrance road, and Caleb watched him go. And somewhere in the middle of watching, he thought about his father again. The man who wouldn't stop. The man who worked past the point of sense because stopping felt like failure. He thought about Eliza's father, who hadn't spoken for 2 days when his pigs died, and who'd rebuilt partially, but never all the way. He thought about all the people who'd come down his entrance road with sick and suffering animals, each of them carrying something beyond the animal. A difficult summer, a sick wife, a 4-year-old who needed milk, an old dog who was the last thing left. The ranch had always been about the horses. That was true. But it had become about something else too, something he didn't have a clean word for. The way a place becomes a place that people know they can come to, not because it has all the answers, but because someone there will take the problem seriously. He thought Eliza had understood that before he did. He thought she'd understood it when she decided to treat Martha Foss's calf without charge, and when she'd sat with Clara Eames while the old dog was treated, and when she'd told Douglas Pruitt's cow helped her learn. She'd been building something from the beginning, not just treating individual animals, but creating a practice that was connected to the community around it. The workshop wasn't just her workspace. It was the center of something that was still growing its edges. He walked back inside and found her in the kitchen, writing in her journal at the table, making notes on the colt, his weight estimate, his condition score, the supplement schedule she was planning. He sat down across from her and she kept writing. "Reeves," he said, "he's going to have trouble affording feed through winter, even if the colt recovers." "I know," she said, not looking up. "I have more hay than I'll need. The herd is back to full health, and I over-ordered for contingency." She looked up. "I'm not suggesting charity," he said. "I'm saying the practical situation is that I have a surplus and he has a deficit, and if his colt is going to recover properly, the animal needs to go back to a situation where it won't fall back." "You could offer him the surplus at cost," she said. "I could offer him the surplus at half cost, with the other half in labor come spring," he said. "I'm going to need help with the east fence expansion. He looks like a man who knows how to work a fence line." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, in that direct way she had, And then something in her expression shifted into the warm, certain thing that was still relatively new on her face, and that he was still getting used to, which he suspected was going to take some time. "Yes," she said, "that's a good idea." "I know," he said. She went back to her journal. He went to make coffee because it was that hour. Outside, the October afternoon was golden and cool and unhurried, and in the workshop the wind chime moved in the breeze, and in the near pasture the horses moved through the gold light with the easy confidence of animals that don't know they almost didn't make it, and wouldn't care if they did. Caesar made it to November. Not that November was a milestone he'd been racing toward. The old horse simply kept going, the way he'd been keeping going for 23 years, eating and being difficult and standing in the sun by the east fence with the proprietary air of an animal who had decided the sun existed largely for his benefit. On a quiet afternoon in early November, Caleb spent an hour at the east fence just standing near Caesar, not doing anything in particular. The horse tolerated this in the companionable way of an old friendship, where presence doesn't require explanation. Eliza found him there at the end of the afternoon. She came along the fence line from the workshop with her hands in her coat pockets and stopped beside him and looked at Caesar, who looked back at her with mild interest. "You're not doing anything," she said. "Correct." "Is that a new development?" "I'm choosing it intentionally," he said. "I'm told that's different." She looked at the horse. "He looks good." "He looks his age," Caleb said, "which is better than it sounds." Caesar shook his head, once, the casual gesture of a horse dismissing whatever the humans near him were concerned about. He turned back to the fence line and went back to his survey of the east pasture, which was his ongoing project and would likely remain so. "I've been thinking about something," Eliza said. "What?" "Next spring, the plant along the creek sage, the one that caused all of this." She looked along the creek line in the distance. "I want to map it, all of it, not just on our property, but along the whole creek system running through the county. Document where it grows, how dense the populations are, which properties are most at risk." She paused. "If I can map it and share that information with the other ranchers and farmers, people can adjust their grazing patterns before they lose animals, before they have to bring them here." He thought about this. "That's a significant project." "It is." She looked at him. "I'm going to need help with the mapping part. I don't have your familiarity with the land layout. You know this county better than anyone." He considered the east pasture, the creek beyond it, the long territory of land that stretched between one property and the next. "It would take most of the spring. We'd need to cover a lot of ground." "I know." "We'd need horses." "I had noticed we have several," she said. He almost smiled. "Almost." "All right," he said. "Spring." "Spring," she agreed. They stood in the November afternoon beside the east fence, the old horse between them doing his ongoing work of simply existing with authority, and the ranch spread out behind them, the stable, the workshop, the repaired fence, the house with 2 mugs on the kitchen table every morning. Not a perfect thing, not a finished thing, a thing in progress, shaped by everything that had happened to it and still being shaped, which was simply what living things were. This was what Caleb thought about, standing there. Not the crisis 7 weeks past, not the fever or the storm or the night he'd believed it was over. He thought instead about the morning after the storm, when the rain had cleared and the light had come through the stable boards in thin silver lines, and he'd looked at Caesar, alive, breathing, and probably still there, and had felt that small, careful thing, like a match struck in a very large room. The room was less large now. It had filled up with things, work and noise and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had someone else in it. A workshop where Penny's shoes made their sound in the morning air. A horse that had refused to die because no one had made it easy for him. You could build things out of whatever survived. That was what he understood now, in a way he hadn't before. Not the things you lost. You couldn't build from those, and pretending you could was its own kind of damage. But from what remained, from what held, from what came through the worst of it still breathing, from that you could make something real. It would have marks on it, evidence of what it had been through. That was not a flaw in the material. That was the material. He had 19 years of hard work in this land. She had a dead woman's notebook and 40 years of knowledge she'd carried here in a leather satchel on a train she'd boarded alone. Neither of those things was the life either of them had planned on. Both of them were exactly what they'd needed. The sun was getting low. Caesar turned from the fence and walked slowly back toward the stable with the unhurried dignity of an old horse who knows his own schedule. Caleb and Eliza watched him go. "Dinner," she said. "I'll be in," he said. She walked back toward the house. He stayed another moment at the fence in the November evening, looking at the land he'd fought for, and the workshop where the light was still on, and the stable where a horse that should have died was bedding down for the night. And he thought about his father, who had worked this land alone and died not knowing if it would hold. It held. It was holding. That was the thing he wished he could say to the man, if time moved differently than it did. Not that everything had worked out perfectly. It hadn't, and it wouldn't. But that the thing he'd built hadn't disappeared. That someone was still here, two people now, working it by the same stubborn insistence that had built it in the first place, and that the stubbornness had turned out to be inheritable, just not in the way either of them had expected. He pushed off from the fence. He went inside. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and Eliza was at the stove with her back to him, and she said without turning around, "The cornbread is better if you let it sit." "I know how cornbread works," he said. "You always say that." "It's always true." She turned and looked at him, and her expression was ordinary. Just a woman in a kitchen at the end of a working day, tired, practical, real. Not a picture of anything, just herself. He sat down at the table, at his side of it, and the two mugs were where they always were, and outside the November dark was coming in over the Texas land that held, and the ranch breathed on.